Okie dokie, welcome back to the this is part 2 of our video series looking at the BTEC exam for Unit 3. Apologies for the first video, I just reviewed that and I can see that it is a little glitchy in terms of the sound, so I expect this one probably will be the same. However, I do not have time or money to go out and buy a new laptop, so we'll have to get over it. So in the second video, what we're going to be doing is looking at part B, the actual exam. So imagine in your mind that a week has passed and we're now in the exam hall and we receive the actual exam booklet. Okay, we open the front cover and we have a look and we find out what is wrong with this product that we're going to redesign. So it gives us all the information. We spend a few minutes reading through and then we jump straight in. Okay, so as part of this exam, once we've read the first part, we then have 5 activities we have to complete. So the first one is a time plan, which we'll talk about in this video. The second section then, or second task, is going to be looking at the available information. So the brief provided by the exam board, the description of what the problem is with the product that we're going to have to address. So it's going through all of that information as well as some data tables to work out what is wrong with this thing and what have we got to do. All right. Task 3 then is to actually create the designs. So the redesign of this product to address the problems with it, making some notes. And then task 4 then is to draw up your final design. And this is the biggie. This is the biggest section of the whole exam. It's half the marks, half the time. Okay. They expect you to spend 4 hours of your 8 hours working on this task here. All right, and then finally at the end we evaluate. So this is a little bit like a design project or like a DT project you might do in year 11, where you sort of do some planning and a bit of looking into the information, you come up with some ideas, come up with a final design, and then evaluate it. All right, now hopefully what you will have done is spent that week between doing your part A research and getting to this exam by doing lots of designs in 3D, speculating what the problem could be, come up with different solutions, different design features that will help you when doing all of this, okay? Because like I said in the last video, it will be super, super helpful to you if you're going in knowing exactly how to draw these things already, all right? Whatever they happen to be. Okay, so let's jump into the time plan. So the time plan is worth 6 marks. Now you'll see on these slides what I've done is I've put the mark scheme on the right hand side. And this is, I'm only ever going to put in the top band, okay, because there will be a second and third set of descriptors for like the lower points. So to get like, I don't know, 3 or 4 points, you need to do some other things, and to get 1 and 2 points, you need to do something else. But I've not included any of that. I'm only putting the top marks, what you've got to do for the top marks, okay? That was a really bad description. Let's move on. I've also highlighted certain bits that might be useful to you as well. All right. So the time plan is 6 marks. It is, I think, in the suggested timings, it does say in the booklet that you should spend about 45 minutes doing your time plan. All right. Which sounds like a lot of time to write up a time plan, but there are 2 parts to this. So some of that time you should spend at the very start of your exam doing an initial time plan, essentially outlining what am I going to spend the next 8 hours doing. All right, so it's laying out your time, going, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to spend this much time doing this, and then this much time doing that. So that's what we do at the start, which is what you traditionally think of when you think of a time plan. However, throughout the exam, we will need to come back to this time plan and reflect on where we are and what we're doing and where we're going. All right, so think of it like a diary or like a project log. Okay, now this is really where the marks are. Looking at previous examples when they've marked them, you can have quite a slim, if not rubbishy, kind of initial time plan, and you can make up for that if you've got really good reflections later on. So I'm not saying don't do an initial time plan or don't put any effort into it, but I'm saying really focus on this second bit, the reflections that we do as we go along. And this tends to be where people lose marks if they're going to, is because people do the time plan at the start and then they fly into the rest of the exam and they go, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. They get into their designs, they get writing and annotating, and they forget to come back. Okay? So it's really important that you don't do that. Make sure the reflections are as detailed as possible, and you talk about possible improvements to the design at each stage. We'll have a look at what that looks like in a second. But let me just see what's on my next slide. Yeah, okay. So this is an example of an initial time plan where obviously I've typed this out, but in your exam you won't have access to IT, probably. So this is just a very, very brief sort of summary of what you would have to do. Now, I've lifted all this straight from the exam booklet because it tells you how many marks are available, what the time they expect you to spend on each thing is, and what the sort of different elements are that you will need to cover within each of those activities. What I would say is, if you do exactly what I've done here, so I have literally just lifted this straight out of the booklet and written it down. I'm not sure that's the best way of going about it. Okay, I would say in this general description, it's probably better to put it into your own words to kind of explain in a little bit of detail what it is you're going to do. All right, so for example, product requirements. You could say there that you're going to go through the project booklet. You're going to look at the brief and find out what the requirements are for the project. Okay, rather than just quoting word for word what's in there. Now, let's have a quick look. Do I want to talk about the mark scheme at this stage? No, I don't. This mainly relates to the reflections, which we'll get to in a second. So yeah, your initial time plan should be something kind of like this. Let me show you the one that I've done, another example. So I've actually sat down with the booklet and drawn out two different ways of doing this. Okay, so on the left here is one way of doing it, and on the right here is another way of doing it. Whoops, daisies. So on the left here is a little bit like the example I just showed you here. So if I were to draw that out in my exam booklet, this is kind of how it would look. All right, so I've got what the activity number is, how many marks are available, what the estimated time is, and what you would need to do. So you can see here, this is kind of what I mean, where I've said don't quote just word for word what's in the booklet. You can see here, I've kind of put it in my own words and changed it slightly. Now, what I would say about doing it this way, almost as a table in the booklet, is you do waste a lot of space. Okay, like if you take this section here where I'm talking about activity 2, well, actually, only about half of this 2D space is being used with information. Like this whole section over here is being wasted. So it may be easier or better, a better use of space, to do it like this. So activity 1, activity 2, over here I'm talking about activity 3. I've kind of done it sort of more of a written style. Yeah, okay, I've used sections and headings and underlines, and that is important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I've put essentially the same information, but you can see it takes up far less space, and it's much more efficient. Okay, now let's just dwell on this point I said about sort of highlighting things and underlining. This is where you're going to want to write down a reminder for yourself, effectively. It's really important in this exam that you put headings, you put subheadings, you highlight things, you structure it in a way that's really easy to see what you've done and where. Okay, so do not do walls of text anywhere. Break things up with subheadings, bullet points possibly, underlining key terms and things like that. Now, you'll see as I go through this example, that's kind of what I've tried to do, is make sure it's really obvious where I've spoken about different things. It just makes it so much easier to pick up the marks later on. When someone's marking this and they're kind of rushing through, especially if, like me, your handwriting is not the neatest in the world, you want to make it really obvious to the person marking this where the marks are, what you've done, and how you, basically how you deserve the marks for saying certain things. Okay, so these are two different ways of doing it. I would probably say do this. If you have a burning urge to do it this way, then carry on. But this is how I would do it. All right. Now, to go with this initial time plan, it may be a good idea to include a Gantt chart. All right. Now, in a way, this is a good and a bad Gantt chart. All right. So what I've got along here, I've got the hours, 8 hours of the exam, and I've put the estimated time that it says in the booklet. So when I'm doing my initial time plan, these sort of hatched areas are what I put in at the start, and then what I've done as I've gone through my exams, I've come back and I've added in the actual time. So I've put a squiggly line here because I spent about 35 minutes doing the initial time plan, and then I overran with my activity 2, like so. You can see it went over into where I should be working on activity 3. Now, if you wanted to do this, that would be really good. So you're doing like estimated times and actual times. You don't have to do it. You don't even have to do it as a Gantt chart. You could do it just as a list if you wanted to. I do think a Gantt chart is a quick way of sort of visually showing this kind of information. And there's lots of debate about how is best to set this out. Do you do it just as activity 1, activity 2, activity 3, etc., or do you within this break it up into sort of into more detail? So, for example, in activity 2, if I go back, is it in here? So in activity 2, we will need to list product requirements, list opportunities and constraints, interpret charts and data, and consider health and safety, etc. Right? So there's 4 things we're going to have to do in activity 2. Do we put in here activity 2 and then we list the 4 things and do boxes for each of those? The examiners would love it. However, what you've got to ask yourself during this exam is, even though there are 8 hours available, it is not as long as you think. Okay? You've got to ask yourself, do you have time to do some of these things that you think, oh yeah, that would be really good if I did that, or really good if I showed it in this way? All right. Now, I would say, looking at how much writing I've done here for my sort of initial time plan, if I'd done this much, and I produced a Gantt chart like that, I think actually I probably would be getting to the point where I'm 45 minutes in. I would be needing to think about thinking about moving on at this point. So, you know, a Gantt chart, nice, yes, especially if you make comments around it and things like that, or comments on it like this. But how detailed you go is up to you. I would suggest that perhaps going too detailed might be biting off more than you can chew time-wise. Okay, so as far as activity 1 goes, this is the sort of initial time plan, the sort of way you should set it out. What we're going to talk about now are the reflection section. So it says here, at the start of the activity, create a short outline project time plan, and then during the other activities, you should record in the activity 1 section of your booklet why specific changes were made and specific action points for the next session. Okay, that's a bit wordy. We're going to go into what that means now, but actually, you know, you can see here it takes up the majority of the instruction space. It will take up the majority of your time for this section. All right. All right. So I've done 2 as an example. I've not bothered to do the rest just for time purposes, but you'll get the idea when we look at these 2. Okay. Now, what I would say is that doing it at the end of each session may not be the best idea. So if I go back, where are the instructions? Here. Okay, here. Why specific changes were made to the design during each session? Well, depending on how the exam's broken up, you may only have 3 sessions. In fact, this year we've planned 3 sessions. So we're going to do, I think it's a 3-hour session, a 3-hour session, and a 2-hour session. Okay, which adds up to 8, I hope. So there are only 3 sessions, which means you don't get the opportunity to do many reflections. All right. Now, what I would suggest is that you break the time up differently so that you can get more reflections in. So some people choose to do a reflection at the end of each activity. So now we've done this plan, they may go off and do activity 1, come back and do, obviously this is activity 1, but come back at the end of doing this initial time plan and do a bit of a reflection. Not that there's any point at this stage, but maybe after activity 2, they'll do that activity. Once they've interpreted all the information, then do a reflection, then go off and do activity 3, the designs, and then do a reflection, then do final design and reflect, and so on. Okay, so you can do it activity by activity. Now, depending on the activity size, it could be 240 minutes between activities, reflections, or it could be 45 minutes between a reflection. So it does vary. If you do it this way, you can have big gaps between your reflection activities. The way I've done it in my example here is I've broken up into 2-hour slots. So I know that by the end of the first 2 hours, I've done my time plan, and I've sort of dived into the main body of the exam, if you like, and unpicking all the information, probably even getting to the design ideas. So I've got something to talk about after 2 hours. And then after 4 hours, I should be, where should I be? I should be into my final design after 4 hours. So again, I've got plenty to talk about in terms of things I've done during the design section. So I would suggest maybe breaking it up into 2-hour time slots. All right. So do 2 hours of the exam, and then pause, do a reflection, do another 2 hours, pause, come back, do a reflection. But like I say, there's different ways of doing this. All right. This is how I would do it. I would do it every 2 hours. I would come back and do a reflection. But like I say, you can reflect. Where is this? Yeah, you can reflect after each activity if you want to, because when you finish an activity, it kind of prompts you to go, okay, what next? Well, actually, that's a really good opportunity for you to pause, reflect, to think, to write up what you've done and where you're going to go next. All right. So you don't have to do it my way every 2 hours. You could do it after each activity, or if you really wanted to, and I probably would advise against this, you could actually do it after each session. So at the end of day 1, maybe spend 10-15 minutes writing up how it went, what you did, what you're going to do next time, and then the same after day 2. But again, you only get a few reflection opportunities there, so they better be good. All right. Right. So let's have a look then. I've done a lot of waffling. Let's have a look at what we actually talk about in the reflections. Okay. So essentially what we're doing is 2 things. Number 1 is it's asking us to explain what changes we've made to the design and to plan out what we're going to do in the next section. Right? I've added a section into here, which we'll talk about in a second, but these 2 things here are what it's looking for. So changes made to the design and action points for the next session. Okay. Now, the one I've added in is basically just a bit of a reflection as to where I am in the time plan. It doesn't really specifically ask for it. If I jump back a second, here you go. It doesn't say here, like, assess where you're at and where you're going. It just says, right, what changes have you made and what are you going to do next? Okay. But I think it's quite nice to put this in because, well, let's read it together. I've put, I should be on my second design by now, but I'm a bit behind schedule, in brackets on my first design. Activity 2 took longer than expected. I will need to make sure, no, what have I said? I will need to make some time back in activity 4. Okay, so I've identified where I am, where I should be, and how I'm going to claw that time back. It doesn't take much in terms of writing. I mean, what's that, like, if 3 and a bit lines? But it does just sort of set the scene for the reflection going, okay, right, this is where I am, this is where I'm going. Now, changes to the design. Now, this can be quite difficult because unless you're actually in the design section, you're actually making changes to the design, well, you're not really changing the design. So let's say I do 2 hours and I'd only got to the end of activity 2, which would be looking at the information available and picking the requirements. Well, at that point, I won't have made any changes to the design, right? But what you can do is say what changes you will make to the design. So at each stage of the exam, each section that you read, each requirement that you go through will kind of inform what you're going to do later on. All right. So the way I would read this is either to sort of go over what changes you have been making, or to say what changes you're going to be making as you go forward. All right. So what have I written here? My first design replaces the chock system and has locks on 2 of the wheels. The other 2 now rotate for improved mobility. So this is kind of saying what I have changed about the design. There is now a step, grip and handrail for improved safety, addressing problems. Yeah, so because I'm in the design section at this point, I've talked about changes I have made. Okay, if I wasn't, if I was, let's say, analyzing the data available to me in Activity 2, so going through the requirements, going through the data table, and I can see, oh, it rusts if I don't put this kind of coating on the material. Well, what I can say here is something like, right, I have not yet started designing, but when I do design, this is what I'm going to change. This is how my thinking about the design has changed based on the information available. Okay? What I'm going to do is, well, I'm not going to read through all this, but what I would say is pause the video, have a break from listening to my waffle, and read what I've put here to see if it makes sense to you, okay? All right, did you do that? Bet you didn't. Okay, well, if you did, let's now talk about this second bit here. So, action points for the next session. All I'm doing here is saying what I'm going to do next, right? So, I'm in my design section after 2 hours. So all I've said here is that I'm going to carry on, basically. I'm going to carry on designing. I'm going to experiment with different methods for addressing the design issues, building upon some of the ideas from Design 1, and reflect again in 2 hours when I should be drawing up my final design. Now, that is what this is, okay? So after my first 2 hours, I haven't got an awful lot to write about, hence why that is quite small. After my second 2 hours, I've got a lot to write about, hence why I've got that, okay? Now, this is something we're going to talk about more in Activity 3, but this is important, right? Where have I said it? Oh yes, I would experiment with different methods for addressing the design issues, building upon some of the ideas from Design 1. Now, it's important when you're doing this to make it sound like a story. You've got to show that your thinking about your product is developing, that you're sort of working your way towards a final design, that you're sort of building your understanding, building your knowledge, improving this thing bit by bit. All right, I'm trying to make it sound here, even though, let's be honest, realistically, what I'm going to do is I've tried a design. I'm just going to try something different on the second design and something different on the third one. I'm making it sound like that's not what I'm doing, right? I'm trying to make it sound like I'm not just going Design 1, Design 2, Design 3. I want them to think that I've done Design 1 and that I'm thinking about Design 1 and I'm thinking, oh, how can I do that differently? How could I improve this bit? And then doing Design 2. So Design 2 is built upon Design 1, even if it isn't really. And the reason I'm doing that is because if I go back, looking at the mark scheme, it says here, entries demonstrate a logical and iterative approach to the design process. So an iterative approach means basically that you're creating this thing by going version to version to version. All right. So you're going, right, here's a design, think about it. Okay, improve, improve, improve. Rather than just going, here's 3 ideas and here's my final idea. They want this to read like a story. In fact, they want the whole booklet to be kind of like a story. They want to see your thinking as you go along, and to see that you're sort of building upon the designs as you go through. Okay, so again, feel free to pause me and read this, all right, because this is the mark scheme for everything we've just been talking about. But I am about to go back to the examples. Where are they? There. Okay, so essentially, I think that kind of wraps up. Let me just see what's on my next slide. Yes, it does. This kind of wraps up Activity 1. So essentially what we're doing is an initial time plan that looks something like this, with or without a Gantt chart, up to you. So initial time plan and reflections, okay? How you break up your time in terms of putting those reflections in is up to you, but this is the kind of thing you're going to need to be doing, okay? So I would say, if you haven't done so already, pause, have a read, maybe go back through this video and make some notes about the important things you should be doing, okay? Right, that is video 2. Slightly less wittery than number 1. By number 5, hopefully, I'll have this down. But yeah, I will see you in the next one.